Woody, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. So 7 months of work, 96 people arrested, being constantly in fear of my life, being assaulted. You know, at one point I was stripped naked by that gang during that operation. And all of those things that I went through for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours.
Neil, we've met before, obviously, but for any new listeners or watchers, could you just briefly describe who you are?
Yeah, I'm a former undercover police officer from the United Kingdom. So I used to catch drug dealers for a living. And now I'm part of the international movement, the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, better known in the UK as LEAP UK.
And what does that aim to do?
We are part of we are the growing movement of police and other law enforcement who are calling for an end to the war on drugs. We call for an evidence-based drug policy.
Interesting, and we'll get into that in a little more detail. But I guess what I'd love to do is go back to kind of the beginning of your career. You were an undercover drugs officer. What was the actual title? Is that correct, or have I said it completely wrong?
I don't know. Just undercover police officer, really.
Undercover police officer. What age did you start the undercover section of your job?
I was 23. Yeah, it was 1993.
23. So how does someone get into undercover police work?
Well, I mean, I just fell into it, to be honest. You see, I'd started in the police, and when I started in the police, I was really terrible at it. I was a very young 19-year-old. I put this uniform on, and I didn't realise how young and naive I was until I was in the police, put it that way. I didn't deal with confrontation very well. I just felt like I was quite sheltered. So I struggled to stay in the job, to be honest, and I only stayed in for the first 2 years just to prove to myself I could, and I was hating every minute of it. Really.
Right.
But I settled in a bit more, and I stayed in. Then it became 4 years I was in the job. But then I got an attachment to the drug squad. I think it was just a month's attachment to start with.
So when you say you had an attachment to the drug squad, is that just a standard thing that happens in the police, that people get put in different places?
No, it happened then because of a particular shift in politics in 1993. So in the UK at that time, there was the mother of all moral panics about drugs. And that was about crack cocaine, because the tabloid newspapers had been telling the British public for years that there was going to be this problem. And they kept publishing stories about how crack cocaine was destroying America.
Right.
You know, with an emphasis on black neighbourhoods, a very sort of racist coverage of what was happening. So the moment that crack cocaine did finally hit the streets of the UK, there was a panic, big moral panic that had been whipped up for years. So there was lots of pressure from the public, and this was perceived as a political pressure from the government, which they then demanded of the police do something about this. So the government actually set priorities for policing, and they said that you must make the investigation of heroin and crack cocaine your number one priority, above anything, above domestic violence, above anything at all. And so there was an enormous amount of financial investment in drugs policing. And so part of that was the idea of giving young rookies like me an attachment to the drug squad and try and share this expertise. Now, the drug squad hated it because they were a very specialist unit, trained in surveillance, and they were seasoned detectives. And to have people like me under their feet got on their nerves a lot. But when I was there, one of them looked me up and down and said, do you fancy having a go at buying some crack cocaine? Which was quite a surprising request, But I thought, I'm game for anything. And so I was given 20 quid and pointed to this particular door. There was a rapidly set up observations point with a camera. And I went to knock on this door. And this huge guy answered the door and said, "Who are you? What do you want? You're not a fucking student, are you? I fucking hate students." And there I was looking at him thinking, I've got no idea who I am, because I hadn't thought about a cover story or anything. I was just told to knock on the door. So I thought, well, that'll do. Yeah, I'm a student. And this woman behind him said, "Is he fucking stupid? You just told him you hate students." But he laughed, and he offered me a wrap of crack cocaine from several in his hand, and I took it and gave him 20 quid. And I walked back to the drug squad and I went, "There you go, I've got it." And that defined the next 14 years of my life, because that kind of undercover work hadn't really happened in the UK before.
Right.
Now, don't get me wrong, I didn't invent undercover work. It had been going on for a lot longer, but normal traditional undercover work was very high end. It was introduced by informants at the top level, not work buying single wraps off street dealers, and trying
With no cover story.
with
or
no cover
prior
story or training or anything. Yeah. So
how rapidly did it get from you doing, "Oh, I'm a student, here's 20 quid," to literally designing a whole cover story and who you were for 6 months at a time?
2 years.
Wow.
But in that 2 years, in that leading up to that, I was doing sort of several weeks at a time.
Yeah.
Or I would be doing more than one job at a time. One would be returning to a particular pub in Leicestershire, arranging to buy stolen cars and things off this particular cocaine dealer. But in the week, I'd be doing another operation somewhere else. So yeah, it was quite busy. And in between that, I was still going back and doing like a couple of shifts in uniform. And it was quite confusing. And then I was told right from the outset that I was not to tell any of my colleagues what I was doing, because that would be dangerous.
Because why would it be dangerous?
Well, this is something I didn't really, truly understand at the start. But I was told in no uncertain terms I must not tell anybody the work I was doing. Now, obviously, this was seasoned drug squad officers, people who'd been detectives investigating drugs crime for a long time. And they knew what they were talking about. And they made it clear to me. And they basically said, you can't trust anybody when you're investigating drugs, organised crime. They have moles everywhere. And I mean, I did as I was told. I didn't tell anybody. And that made it quite a strangely lonely place, to be honest. But it was many years later before I realised the genuine risks of it and how different it is doing normal policing to doing drugs policing, because corruption isn't a problem in normal policing. It's only a problem when you're investigating drugs.
Oh, that's interesting. And we'll get into that in a bit more depth, I think. But so just going back a little bit then, so you're still a fairly young man. And when you say about going to a pub over and over again for a couple of weeks to buy cars off a drug dealer or something, stolen cars, at that point when you're doing that, did you feel like you had a shield because you knew you were an undercover police officer and you knew that if it was uncovered who you were, they might be afraid to do something to you because you were a police officer? Or did you feel in danger at that point?
No, I very much felt in danger, very much so. I mean, for example, the pub job where I was buying various things, I'd seen the intelligence about these people and I knew how dangerous they were. And they were genuinely dangerous people. But it was the danger which made me, I suppose it's the danger that made me develop. Now, I was genuinely a pretty crap cop, uniform cop, certainly the first 2 or 3 years. But I'd found with undercover work, I found something that I could rapidly develop in. And it suited my personality and it suited the way that I could develop. And that danger, the risk, made me develop very quickly. And also, I learned by mistakes, and I made some really dangerous mistakes. And when you come close to physical injury, it's amazing how you quickly develop.
Yeah, of course. Well. Yeah, I suppose the penalty for failure was quite high in your specific role.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, one of the big mistakes I made, particularly with that pub job, was to have something to talk about. I made myself out to be a connoisseur of amphetamines.
Right. Okay.
Which I'm clearly not at all. But, I would talk about the old days of Dexys and the different tablets and the different types and how much nicer methamphetamine is to your normal British amphetamine sulfate and these things like this. And, just because I'd read it in a book, I thought I could pull it off. And I suppose I was doing until one day this main target of the operation came to me and said, "Hey, you, I've got something for you." And he held up this little see-through bag with this sort of pink toxic-looking goo in it.
Oh, God.
And he says, "You're going to love this." And I'm thinking, yeah, okay. And the trouble is, he must have picked up on a momentary reticence on my face, just a flash of reticence. And I then picked up on the fact that he'd picked up on my reticence because I could see a momentary doubt across his face. And I knew in that split second, I had to pour water on that suspicion. I had to. Otherwise, this was only going in one direction. I was in trouble. I knew from that split second I was in trouble. So I had to show him enthusiasm. So I said, yeah, great. I'm going to have some of that. Thanks. Yeah, dip my finger in and put it in my mouth. And he looked at me and said, "You're going to need more than that with your tolerance."
Oh, God.
Thinking, oh, good, okay. So I stuck my finger in again and got a big blob and put it in my mouth and could almost feel the mouth ulcer, forming on my tongue dissolving. And went down my throat. It was hot and started that weird warm feeling in my belly. And of course, within about 20 minutes, I was completely out of it. It was, at the time, the average seized amphetamine was 5% pure. This was 40% pure.
Right.
Genuine base. And now I knew enough about the drug that I wasn't going to overdose, but it was a rough ride. I mean, it was too intense. It was anxiety inducing. It was horrible.
So did you have to get away from him?
Oh, I had to get out. I had
So
to
you
make
were
my
like,
excuses
right.
and go. Yeah, I had to make.
Thanks for the amphetamine. Now I've got to immediately leave.
Yeah, I just said, yeah, I'm going to go party. I'm looking for a
Right,
party.
right.
I'm going to go to this place. I'm going to go to this club. I'm going to meet up with this person. And but actually, what I did is scuttled back to my backup team and went to the safe location and quickly dictated some notes and then got driven home. I couldn't drive.
Yeah. That leads on to an interesting point, actually, which I see a lot of people asking about on the internet, because I think a lot of, this is including myself, a lot of our understanding of how undercover work works is from Hollywood films.
Yeah.
So there's this kind of like, it always splits between the films that show that you're not allowed to take drugs, and that's how the criminals catch people out, and the films that show that you can take drugs to maintain your cover. So can you clear that up for us?
Well, yeah, I mean, clearly you can. I mean, it's just common sense. If I needed to take some drugs to maintain my cover, then I needed to do it. It's as simple as that, really. Thankfully, it very rarely happened, very rarely, because you develop a good sense of survival. And I wish I'd developed survival for that day, because I tell you what, I didn't sleep for 3 nights.
Oh, God. Right.
But mind you, my house has never been so tidy.
Right, okay.
When I was being driven home, I was daydreaming about the fact that I'd got 8 cans of lager in the fridge, thinking that's going to take the edge off.
Right.
And as I finished the 8th can, I felt no different at all.
Jesus.
But thankfully, I didn't. I mean, I had to have cannabis a few times, but that's just cannabis, isn't it? But thankfully, I never had to have anything stronger like heroin or, I mean, crack cocaine wouldn't have worried me particularly, but heroin would have done, with no tolerance.
But I suppose it would be a strange situation where someone would force you to take heroin, I guess, wouldn't it? Unless you'd built your cover to be around someone who took it.
Well, someone was really suspicious once. I was in a car, and the guy that was introducing me to the dealer was in the front seat. I was driving. The dealer got in the back, and I knew they were suspicious of me. Certainly the dealer and the dealer's mate. So I knew how to cook up. So what I did is I parked up in the street and I cooked up in the car. So I got my spoon and my lighter and I threw the filter in, put some citric acid in, cooked it up till it bubbled, put it into the barrel and dropped my trousers and positioned my groin to inject into my groin and injected into the car seat.
Wow.
So, that was one way that at that time, it built. They never doubted me after that.
So I guess the groin thing is good because presumably they wouldn't be actively staring into your groin. So it's a way of kind of.
Yeah, exactly. And they're not going to stare. And for it is the most. I have to make this very clear. From harm reduction advice, going into the groin is the worst thing you can do.
Right.
People do go into the groin because it doesn't heal properly, and you can keep going into it all the time. And so quite often people go into the groin because they've damaged the veins in their legs and arms, and going into the groin, it doesn't heal up the same, so you can use it for longer. But it is incredibly dangerous, you know. And
then when you did that, you kind of injected into the car seat. Would you then have to act in a way that would, you know, make it look like you just received an injection of heroin?
I could have done, and there have been times when I would play gouching or rattling. Gouching being under the effect of heroin, or rattling being making out that I'm withdrawing from it. But on that occasion, I didn't behave any different at all.
It's just
I was presenting myself as a problematic heroin consumer who was just stopping myself being ill, really.
okay. So let's move to the bit that you talked about earlier about the longer periods of time that you'd spend, the extended periods where you'd spend in a role. So can you talk us through how it worked? Like when you arrived in a new town, like would they say you're going to this area to investigate this area, or would they say we want you to investigate this gang or this person who lives in this area? Can you just talk us through how it works with moving somewhere and setting yourself up?
So quite often before I went to a place, we would have the opportunity to build up a legend. So for example, if I said that I'd spent the last 6 months selling on a market stall in the town of Chesterfield, and I used to go to a pub in Chesterfield and knew that, you know, I would have to spend time going to that pub in Chesterfield. So if it was checked up, then I would know the name of the person behind the bar, and I would know enough detail about that to survive any intrusive sort of surveillance from the opposition, so to speak. So you put those kind of things in place, and you think very carefully about the legend. And with every passing year, that legend had to be thought about in more detail, much more detail. But whenever I went to a place, now, and this is an important point actually, so I'm glad you've asked me this question, because wherever, say that a constabulary wanted to run this operation, they would have to run it as per the rules of the East Midlands Special Operations Unit, according to national guidelines. But once this team was assembled, and it tended to be assembled from those people who are involved in crime investigation, who are good at what they do, they would all be told that they must not communicate at all before or during the operation with any other cop. And they would be set up in a building completely away from a police station. They would be cocooned from it, completely separate. And just before I got there, they would all be sat down and given a written lawful order. And they would be told, you must not ask the undercover operative their real name or where they're from or any other personal details. And if you do, you'll be disciplined. Now, a lawful order is a big deal in the police. It really makes you sit up and take notice that, you know, you're going to be in trouble if you breach this lawful order. Now, the reason for that lawful order is to protect me. But to protect me from who? It's to protect me from my colleagues. And the fact that this safe location is separate from a police station and it's cocooned from normal operations is to protect me. Now, this is important to note because that kind of protection doesn't exist for any other kind of policing. This is only for drugs covert investigations. Because let's face it, that's trying to protect me from corruption. And the corruption doesn't exist in any other kind of policing.
And do you think that process exists as a really stringent safeguard for things that could possibly happen? Or do you think its existence is an acceptance that the corruption is real?
Very, very clearly, it is because of an acceptance that the corruption is real. It's an attempt to defend against what is accepted to be endemic.
So, right, yeah, I mean, that's that must have been quite an intense thing for you, in the sense that I guess what you've described there to me, it feels like what you're saying is you going into that situation, once you get in there, what you're essentially being told is all these people who are now responsible for keeping you alive potentially might be corrupt and might actually not have your best interests at heart.
Yeah, exactly that. And I'm using the same pseudonym and fake details to the gangsters on the street as I am to the cops that are my backup.
Yeah, that's really weird, isn't
and
it?
Quite often, I've had times when I wonder who I feel most at risk from.
Really?
More often than I would like to dwell on too much, to be honest.
Really? And did you ever feel that throughout your time there was places you were when you felt, I'm not quite as safe as I'd like to be with this group of colleagues?
Yeah, absolutely. Operation in Leicester in 2001. Some very strange things happened at the end of that operation where I did not trust the activities of my team, and I still went out on the streets, and that's when I ended up having a gangster find the hidden camera on me when I was already suspicious of my backup team from their behaviour, and that almost got me killed because he found that camera, and I ended up being chased across a car park by a car trying to drive down a pavement after me and trying to run me down, and they missed me by 2 meters. You know, and I'd gone 7 months of that operation without any problem like that.
And do you look back on that time now and you know, how do you feel about it? Do you think it was coincidence, or are you still suspicious about?
I'm absolutely suspicious, especially with things that happened to me with the years afterwards. I mean, I suppose my most infamous or my biggest brush with corruption was within the operation in Nottinghamshire. Now, for the Nottinghamshire investigation, there was lots of pressure under me to find out about the sort of gang wars that were going on at the time, because at the time the Bestwood cartel, who was run by Colin Gunn, was at war with everybody else. And at the time, the shootings in Nottingham were major news, like front page newspaper news. There was talk that because of this daily shootings in Nottingham, that the Home Office was considering taking control of Nottinghamshire Constabulary off the Chief Constable.
Right.
You know, it was that big a news. So there was that kind of pressure going on. Now, I was only on the periphery of the Bestwood cartel's operation. I wasn't high end, but I was doing my best to get close to them. And I did buy drugs off one of his lieutenants. But after 4.5 months into that operation, I'd just been interrogated by that particular lieutenant. He interrogated me he went with a knife pressed into my groin, which is really uncomfortable. I can tell you. In fact, it's quite off-putting.
Was that just a routine thing, or had he become suspicious of you?
I think that was his routine. But
Just testing.
Yeah, just testing. You know, it had taken me 4.5 months to get to an introduction to him.
Sure.
And yeah, he was vicious. So that had been a long day at the office, so to speak. The next morning, 2 of my backup team went off sick. You know, we'd been all working long hours, and so I was introduced to 2 new cops. So the first one, I met him, no problem at all, shook his hand. The next one, I shook his hand and the hairs went up on the back of my neck. And I was just deeply suspicious of this guy. You know, but when you've been working undercover for months, you know, your senses are pretty fine-tuned. You know, you're very sensitive to even for nuanced body language. And this guy was just wrong. So I complained to the SIO, the guy in charge, and I said, look, boss, I can't have this guy knowing what I'm doing. So he excluded them both. He was great. So I put that on my mind. I was reassured.
So would he say anything like, why? Would you just say it's a gut feeling, I don't like it, and that was enough?
That's what I said to him, and that was enough for him.
Right.
He said, well, if you're not happy, that's it.
Great.
Which, yeah, there's good support from him, really. So he just got rid of them, and they hadn't been in the briefing, so there was nothing lost. Anyway, I put that on my mind, having been reassured. 12 months later, when Colin Gunn was brought down by a very huge and detailed operation by Nottinghamshire Constabulary, it turned out that cop I'd taken an exception to, a guy called Charlie Fletcher, was an employee of Colin Gunn.
My God.
So it's clear that Colin Gunn got closer to my inner circle than I did to his by some considerable way. Now, Charlie Fletcher was paid £2,000 a month on top of his police wages, plus bonuses for good information. And by the time I'd met him, he'd been in the police for 7 years.
Right.
And it's only good fortune that he was caught. Now, in the debrief for that, and I met with some senior police, and one of them at the time said to me, look, Woodsy, of course, we know this happens. With this much money involved, how can it not happen? Now, people should let that really sink in, because this is an attitude I've heard from many senior police, not just in Britain, around the world, that it is accepted that organised crime is so wealthy from the organised crime that control the drug supply are so wealthy that they can routinely corrupt police, that they pay people to join the police, they pay people to join the prison service and other institutions, and that our drug policy has caused blanket corruption. That's accepted. Now, I think it's important for the public to know that, because if the public understand that, then they will bring pressure on the political systems to make things change.
Okay. So just to jump back a little bit. So when you arrive in a new place and you are integrating yourself with the community and you've got a sort of, I guess, a mission that you're trying to accomplish, what was your feelings about the people that you were meeting? Like with the drug users or the drug dealers, were you seeing them as sort of enemies of the state? Were you seeing them as people that were bad and needed to be put in prison, or was it just a job for you? You know, like what was your connection with them?
Yeah, I mean, when I started working undercover and for the first few years, I was really pleased to be doing the work, not just because it was making me develop. I was feeling myself getting better at it, and because I found it enjoyable as an intellectual exercise as well, but also because I felt like I was doing the right thing. You know, these drug dealers were destroying our society as I saw it. And I looked down completely on the people who were using these drugs problematically. I saw them as less than human because I saw them as people who were stupid enough to have tried these drugs in the first place and didn't have the willpower to get themselves out of it. I just looked down on them, really judgmental. But I suppose it was my method at developing the tactics that really got me to see them clearly. Because I realised that if I needed to survive, in order to keep myself safe in that environment, I needed to understand how to behave. And to do that, I needed to understand who were my peers, my apparent peers in that environment, which is the most problematic heroin and crack cocaine users.
Sure.
People who are living on the edge of society, living in squats, or the homeless, or part of that community. And in order to get to know them and understand them better, I spent a lot of time listening to them. And it became clear to me that every single one of those people had a story, every single person. And all of them were where they were because of childhood trauma. All of them. They all had an abusive father. Like one guy said to me, yeah, I used to get battered, but it's all right. I know I deserved it.
Yeah.
And that was such a common phrase. Or Uma, one of the kindest people I've ever met, this young woman called Uma, or that was a nickname in Northampton. She said to me, yeah, I can give up heroin. And I do regularly to bring my tolerance down. I'll stop for 2 weeks. But the trouble is, at the end of that 2 weeks, I've become suicidal because I remember the feeling of my uncle's fingernails as he sexually abused me as a little girl.
Jesus, yeah.
So she was using heroin to blot out that emotional pain. And for her, that was a completely rational decision because heroin was keeping her alive. And that's not uncommon. I met lots of people like that. And time again, I was listening to these people and thinking, well, if I'd been through that, I would more than likely be in exactly the same place.
Yeah,
and that's just something I hadn't understood as an arrogant young man, really.
Yeah, it's so complex, isn't it? And I can see how as a young man as well, who was at the height of his game and doing a good job and probably being rewarded for it, that must have made it even more hard because you're going, I'm doing really well here, and yet I'm getting these creeping feelings of morality.
Yeah.
But before you got to the point where those feelings of morality sort of took over, could you talk us through some of your most dangerous operations?
Well, I told you the one about when the guy found my camera and he tried to kill me with the car.
Did you always have a camera on you? Would that always be a thing?
Well, you wouldn't wear a camera to start with because you're very much at risk of being searched to start with. So right. I would take the decision to wear one once I perceived the risk of being searched to be sufficiently reduced.
Got you.
So
the thought of being in a situation like you're describing, knowing I had a camera or what, in the movies, they're always the most tense scenes where someone's wearing it and the people are talking about searching them and stuff like that. The adrenaline must have just been unbelievable in those cases. Well,
yeah. And this is how I suppose the death of 1,000 cuts for PTSD works, because I've got complex PTSD. I'm diagnosed and it's a chronic condition. For the kind of things I've experienced, it's not just one singular event. It's not. It's things that eats away at you. It's a death of a thousand cuts. So, in 2001, you know, I had my camera was found, and it almost got me killed. So when I was wearing a camera in 2004, yeah, when I put it on, my heart rate went up. I was sweating. I was having to calm myself, and I was having to rationalize it. And for that operation, for the Burger Bar Boys,
for anyone who's unaware, who were the Burger Bar Boys?
Okay, so back in 2004, I think that's the year I did that operation, the Burger Bar Boys were a very infamous gang. Infamous for being regularly at war with their rivals, the Johnson crew in Birmingham. The main target for my operation was implicated in 7 different murders. He was also the person who provided the machine guns for the infamous murder of Letitia Shakespeare and Charmaine Harris. So they were very notorious, and they were genuinely very brutal. And they'd taken over the drug supply in Northampton, so the Birmingham gang, but they were spreading their influence. So when I studied the intelligence, like I have to do as an operative to agree that it was a justified operation, it was quite clear in the intelligence that this gang, they were using sexual violence as part of their reputation building. You know, they were gang raping people for drug debts, and
male and female.
That's part of the intelligence, yeah.
Wow.
And in fact, during the operation, they did a gang rape in one of the cars that I knew them in, and that morning the car was found burnt out. So they were very good at covering their tracks. They were very savvy. They were very brutal, and I had to really develop a good legend. And I spent a long time trading in stolen property, going shoplifting with some street people, which was great fun.
Which actually, that's another question. So are you allowed to commit crimes to maintain your cover?
Yeah. Right. Yeah. If it's justified. I mean, look at it this way. I never had any intention of keeping the stolen property. I would take it back to the safe location. So that means that the act of theft isn't complete, because I have no intention of permanently depriving it. But again, it could be easily justified, even if there was a theft. So yeah, I did shoplifting, and it was good fun. I know I had the get out of free jail card, which means I didn't have the same concerns of others.
Cheat code, yeah.
So I spent a long time developing a reputation of finally getting an introduction directly to the Burger Bar Boys. And they would only deal with certain people directly. I'd been buying off their minions. And that day when I got an introduction, I was taken to where they were sort of holding court, their sort of temporary headquarters, which was a snooker club in the centre of Northampton. I was directed in there, and I was directed into the gents' toilets, which is quite a big room, several cubicles and urinals there. And within a few moments, the door burst open, like banged open dramatically, and this hooded figure came in, and he went into the cubicle, stood on the toilet, and looked over the closed door and said, "What's this?" And I got an introduction from the guy who was my mate, who I'd got to know. And then the next thing, the door burst open again, and 4 more hooded figures came in, and they came in and they started walking around me in a circle. And the guy in the cubicle was asking me questions and asking my mate questions and changing the nature of the question, trying to catch me out. And as he was doing this, one of them would headbutt me on the side of the ear. Or another one would push me, and the other one would punch me in the ribs. And all of the time, the sort of violence was starting to increase, and my ear was hurting. You know, if you've been headbutted on the ear, it's surprisingly painful. But this sort of sense of imminent extreme violence was building, and I knew what they were capable of. You know, I'd seen the intelligence, I'd heard what people had been saying on the streets, and I really thought that this was it. I was either going to get murdered, or I was going to be left in a beaten bloody mess in there. And all the time I'm answering these questions.
So you just trying not to react to the violence? Are you just answering questions and then being hit?
Yeah.
You're not saying,
yeah,
why are you hitting me or anything? You're just, no.
I didn't say anything to them. I was just answering his questions and putting up with all of it. And that was the right thing to do. That was the right behaviour for who I was purporting myself to be. And my poor mate, he was shaking. He was literally shaking. He was just pale, dripping with sweat and shaking. And the thing is, he'd made me learn an extra cover story that we'd known each other for years.
Right.
Because he was backing me up by saying, yeah, I've known him for years, mate. Which he hadn't.
Yeah.
He was just trying to get me the hookup that I'd asked him to do. So it was... And I'm also another worry I had was would my new mate suddenly bottle it and say, no, I don't really know him. I didn't know that. So, any manner of things could have gone wrong. And then all of a sudden he said, all right then, what do you want? And I went, I'll have 1 and 1, please. As polite as that. I said, what? I'll have 1 and 1, please. Meaning a 0.4 deal of heroin and a 0.4 deal of crack cocaine. And I gave him 40 quid. And I was given, he handed me the drugs, because as soon as he said, all right, what do you want then? Without saying a word, the 4, they just went out in single file, like all coordinated, beautifully choreographed. And they did the deal. And then we exchanged phone numbers, and he put me as my nickname. And weirdly, I should explain this really, but my nickname for that operation was Woody. And so anyway, we exchanged phone numbers, and I knew I was in there, and that was the most important part of the operation. I got past that barrier, and from that point onwards, I spent months gathering evidence of conspiracy against the whole gang, the six Burger Bar boys, and eventually 90 of their wider gang, the backup team, people who were working for them, runners, sex workers, all sorts of different people. But I should make a point about the name, why I called myself Woody. And the reason is because I'd got to a point where I was so disturbed by the corruption that I'd come across. I told you about the undercover, the cop who was a gangster. Yes. And there's so much corruption I'd come up against that I'd gone into that operation genuinely nervous, or genuinely feeling completely vulnerable to corruption. Completely. And so my way of dealing with that and still doing the job was to sort of stick 2 fingers up at the universe.
Right.
To just say, fuck it. I'm going to use almost my real name.
And that was a huge operation, that bringing down that gang, right? That was one of your biggest ones.
Oh, it's easily the biggest one. Yeah, in terms of, I mean, I think I'd had 56 or 60 people arrested for the one previous, but this was 96 people. And not only was it 96 people, it was literally every single person involved in the trade in that town, like everybody. So 7 months into it, I'm thinking, wow, this is going to be huge, because there wasn't anyone I'd met. I'd met everyone involved.
Yeah.
I'd got everyone's number. There was no new phone numbers to meet. There was no names I'd heard I hadn't met and bought drugs from.
And when did it start to shift for you, when you started to realise that you didn't believe you were having a positive impact anymore?
Yeah, and that's a difficult question to answer, to be honest, because I went through a long process of being resistant to the conclusions that were forming in my head. I kept being faced with my own realisation. The evidence was quite clear in front of me, but I kept being resistant to it. So I kept going through these internal ethical discussions with myself. Look, these people need help. I'm preying on them. Look, this is not having any impact. But really, whereas I was resistant to the obvious conclusions, the real hammer blow, which made me face up to those, was the end of that operation, because I was so excited. 96 people, all these people are going to be arrested. There were hundreds of cops involved in that, hundreds. And every single person in that trade was caught, everyone. So the intel officer for that operation was tasked with keeping his ear to the ground to find out the impact of that operation on the streets of Northampton. And he spoke to me a week or so afterwards, after the dust had settled and everyone was arrested. He says, yep, Woody, we managed to interrupt the drug supply in Northampton for a full 2 hours. So 7 months of work, 96 people arrested, being constantly in fear of my life, being assaulted. At one point I was stripped naked by that gang during that operation. And all of those things that I went through for the sake of interrupting the drug supply for 2 hours. Now, I don't know for sure that the Burger Bar Boys' infamous rivals, the Johnson crew, were the people who took over the drug supply. But you can sort of picture the scene, can't you? The rival gang gets a phone call. They start laughing amongst themselves. Hey, boys, put the order in. Buy loads more gear. Because guess what the cops have done for us? The cops have locked up 6 of the Burger Bar Boys. Let's go and take over Northampton.
And is that just because there is always, once a void is created, there's just a load of people waiting to fill that void in terms of suppliers?
Always, at every single level, both citywide, regionally, or internationally, wherever we're at the world, it's the same story. The police never reduce the size of the market. They never reduce the size of the market. But we do something because we do all this work. What we do is we change the shape of that market. And that changing shape is never an improvement. And what I mean by that is that if you create a sudden gap in the market, yeah, you've created a massive money-making opportunity. Massive, because we're talking vast amounts of money here. It's fought over by more than one person. So more often than not, police operations, police successes, and I use the word very loosely, those successes lead to an increase in violence. But more importantly, from one of the themes that we've talked about today, is the corruption, the impact on corruption. Now, covert police have said to me, look, of course corruption happens with this much money involved, how can it not? But it's more complicated than that. Policing activity actually leads to the corruption. Because when you, and I've done this, when I've arrested a gang or kingpin character that controls the supply of a quarter of a city, the gang that's most able to take up that opportunity is a gang that controls another quarter of the city. So what you're doing is you're increasing the influence of the rivals.
I see.
And actually, often, organised crime use police informants to get the police to get rid of their rivals. So they're using the police as that mechanism. So the police are either doing it directly for organised crime or unwittingly for organised crime. And what happens over time is not necessarily at street level, but further up the ladder, it means that over time, monopolies are created or cooperatives are created. And this happens at every level. Only last year, the National Crime Agency or various law enforcement agencies slipped out an announcement that British organised crime groups and Dutch organised crime groups are now allied with Italian mafia. Now, they used to be rivals. They didn't used to work together, but now they do. They've formed a cooperative. They share their resources. Now, when you get monopolies and cooperatives, it means that they have more disposable income. And if they have more disposable income, they have more to invest in corruption. And the biggest asset of organised crime is corruption. So the mechanism of policing is increasing the corruption over time.
I mean, you're painting an exceptionally bleak picture of the effects of policing drugs. But for people listening, I suppose one of the things they'll be asking is, well, what's the alternative? You can't presumably just go, okay, no more rules and no more police, can you?
Well, no. I mean, this is the misunderstanding about the way things are. Things are not controlled now. They are out of control because prohibition is an absence of rules. It's an absence of control. The alternative is to take control away from organised crime by legally regulating these drugs. Drug prohibition has not worked. It's been and is being a disaster. Drugs have never been more available. They've never been cheaper or stronger or more varied. Organised crime has never made as much money as they're making more money with every passing year. So the alternative is to take control. It's starting to happen. Many countries now have legal cannabis markets. North America, Germany's about to go legal, Malta's just gone legal. And cannabis takes a lot of money away from organised crime, but we need to go much further and we need to do it urgently. Another example of regulation that's been happening for a long time is in Switzerland. They started prescribing heroin to problematic heroin consumers in 1994. And because of that, they no longer have a heroin problem. They don't have people dying from heroin. They don't in the Netherlands because the Netherlands copied Switzerland. And you know, the real kick in the teeth for us in Britain is that the Swiss used British evidence to do that, to develop that policy. And since then, our organised crime have been getting richer and richer from heroin, and more people have been dying, whereas in Switzerland, they've halved their burglaries. They don't have people dying from heroin, and their organised crime are robbed of that income stream.
And what would you say to people who would say something like, if you make the drugs freely available, more people want to try them and want to test them, and then potentially will get addicted to them as a recreational thing?
Well, it depends on the drug, because we have to treat each drug according to its relative risks. The most dangerous drug, and this is scientifically proven as well by the comparators in report published in The Lancet, I think in 2007, and various other studies, the most dangerous drug is alcohol. And we could control alcohol better with better regulation. But other drugs need different regulation. Cannabis, it should be regulated with good social equity. It needs to be controlled so children can't get easy access. And the evidence is in from North America that legally regulated markets protect children better because child consumption has gone down in those markets. And protecting our children is a key and important part of what drug policy should be. Now, if you look at the other drugs in the middle, MDMA, for example, there are huge numbers of people using MDMA this weekend at festivals like Boomtown. MDMA is the perfect example of a drug which is not banned because it's dangerous. It's dangerous because it's banned. The harm that's caused from MDMA is from the fact that it's an unregulated product. Now, would more people take MDMA if it was legally available for adults in a licensed pharmacy? You know what? I don't know. And I don't really care because people don't get addicted to MDMA. It's not something that people develop a problematic relationship with. People who consume it do so, generally, about 3 or 4 times in 12 months. 3 or 4 times a year. That's not something that people develop a problem with. So do I care if even more people take MDMA and dance to music in a field whilst on that drug? Do I care? No, I don't. What I care about is our children having easy access to it because organised crime don't care who they sell to. What I care about is young people dying or having health difficulties from an unregulated product. That's what I care about.
It's a really compelling argument and logically makes complete sense. I guess as a final point to you, what do you want to happen? What are you campaigning for now, and what would you hope to see as a change in the next 5-10 years?
Right. Well, as part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, we campaign on a lot of things. Now, obviously, we want the full goal. We want all of the drugs legally regulated and controlled. But there are many reforms that we can do, and there's many things that we're working on at the moment, and I'm working on, for incremental reforms. So, for example, in the UK at the moment, we have record drug deaths. They do also in the States. They've got drug death problems everywhere, Australia, all around the world. And most of those drug deaths are opioids. Now, there are simple ways, while we wait for our governments to prescribe heroin to take control away from organised crime, while we wait, there's lots of things we can do. We can have overdose prevention centres, which the UK governments are dragging their feet with, and they're dragging their feet with in the US. In Canada, they have them. They save lives. No one has died from an overdose in an overdose prevention centre, a place where people can go and safely take their drugs. In the absence of overdose prevention sites, we can make ready access and easy access to naloxone. Now, naloxone, I always carry my kit because I'm naloxone trained. Naloxone reverses a heroin overdose. And if there was more naloxone out there, literally less people would die. Half the people who die from heroin die in company. And which means that at least half of the deaths could be prevented. There is another issue I've been working on, and this is possibly the most pressing issue that we could work on. And that is the fact that we cannot fight the climate crisis until we end drug prohibition. We can't. Because for COP26, and for those that don't know, that was the climate crisis, the climate conference. At COP26, the wrong people were around the table. We needed to have the drug cartels there.
Right.
In fact, you could even say only the drug cartels can save the planet.
Really?
Because all of the equatorial countries were there and they signed up deforestation pledges. But those pledges were meaningless because they don't control their own backyards.
Mm.
Brazil signed the pledge. Deforestation in Brazil has gone up 69% since. And the reason is that those governments don't control those forests. Organised crime do.
Right.
And it comes back to the topic that we've been talking about throughout this discussion, and that's corruption. And the fact that policing has caused this corruption to be so big that it's literally taken over entire nations. So West Africa, for example, most of West Africa is a narco state. Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Senegal. Guinea, for example, apparently has the fastest deforestation on earth. And about a year ago, there was a military coup there. And that military coup was about who controlled the assets from the cocaine smuggling. It was basically a drug gang war.
Mm.
So these governments are now run by transnational organised crime. If you look at the Mexican cartels, for example, there used to be 20 cartels, but policing and the activities of the drug war means that there's now only 3.
Right. And
And each-
presumably they're much more powerful.
And each one of those 3 now has much more disposable income, and they have a bigger GDP. Those cartels have a bigger GDP than West African countries, and they've used that power to take over those countries.
Mm.
So how can you get a government to agree to a deforestation pledge when they're not in control?
Mm.
How can you do that? Well, you can't. And unfortunately, whereas deforestation is important everywhere, it's important that we plant trees in the UK or Sweden or north of North America, but it's not as important that we maintain as we keep the trees in the green belt, which is around the hottest part of the earth, the equator, because it sequesters substantially more carbon. And arguably, it's the single most important aspect of fighting the climate crisis, because you can eventually stop nations burning coal, but you can't replant 500-year-old trees in the jungle and the equator. So the only way we can solve this crisis is through good governance. But the corruption caused by the war on drugs has taken away that governance. So we have to solve drug prohibition first. So we've got 2 simple choices. We either seriously talk to the drug cartels, or we take their power away from them by legally regulating the drug trades. We have no other choice.
It's a fascinating conversation, and it's amazing to think that where we started a little while ago was somebody going and spending 20 quid by knocking on a door, and that sort of has sprawled into the understanding about the implications for ultimately what we're discussing now is the entire human race, isn't it? Well, our society at the very least. Look, Neil, it's been an absolute pleasure to meet you again, and the thing that I always find really fascinating about your story is the fact that you were somebody who was very good at a certain thing and were open-minded enough to completely reverse your mission in life to almost the exact opposite of what you'd been working at. Thank you so much for coming in. Thank you for your time. Good
Right.
luck.
Thank you. Good to see you as well.
Good to see you too. And you look well, by the way.
And you.
So that was Neil Woods, an undercover narcotics officer. I'm joined now by the episode's director, Josh. What were your thoughts on that?
Very depressing, actually, I found that.
Yeah, I'd agree.
Just like someone that has, similar, that he switched his entire view of what he was doing, and he dedicated his life to something that he realised was making the problem infinitely worse. And we're still there. We're still fighting a war on drugs, and it just gets worse.
Takes a lot, I guess, to be able to admit that to yourself,
Yeah.
that something you've dedicated your life to was making things worse. The bit that really stood out to me was when he said that after 7 or 8 months of work and 96 people arrested, they'd interrupted the supply chain for 2 hours.
It's so depressing, isn't it?
I mean, it just makes you think, what were we all doing? Like,
Yeah, and the way that, that sort of chain reaction of people funding drugs, who are buying drugs, it's kind of like, it's just so systemic, and it's clearly not going to work this way, but it feels like the political social will is just not there to radically overhaul it and effectively give out drugs, regulate them, take it away from criminals. put it on governments, but you just I can't really see it properly happening. Potentially decriminalisation is obviously the next step, but as he's saying, like that's not going to solve the issue if where the drugs are coming from, they're being controlled by criminal entities.
What did you think, Bryony?
The standout moment for me was at the end when he talked about the impact of the drug community and the criminality around drugs and the environment. That stuck in my head so much, and I'm going to be thinking about that for many days to come, and an angle that I haven't heard before. And when he explained it, it just made complete sense and so much clarity that I couldn't believe I hadn't thought about it before. And actually, I found it quite impressive and admirable, actually, that it sounded like it's come at a personal cost for him.
Oh, yeah.
Because he did touch on the fact that he'd been diagnosed with complex PTSD, and he mentioned some things quite casually that sound really traumatic. But he still carries on his mission. He's got a...
He's steadfast about it.
Exactly.
Yeah, no,
I think that's really admirable.
Everyone always asks me to do this one on stream.